At 9 in the evening, Susan's phone vibrated. A message from her son. Just a short sentence, yet it was enough to make her entire world collapse. Mom, I think maybe I can't join this trip with the family. My wife wants it to be just her family. Susan slowly sat down on the leather chair in the living room, still holding the phone that had just vibrated once more, but she could not bring herself to look at the screen. The whole room suddenly felt empty, as if everything she had ever believed in had disappeared. She had spent 3 years preparing for this trip. She had paid for every flight, rented a seaside villa, booked sightseeing tickets, and created what she believed would be the perfect vacation for the family. But now, all she received in return was a cold line of text. Every sacrifice, every effort suddenly seemed meaningless. She sighed and looked out the window where the dim glow of the streetlights fell softly into the house. For so many years, she had always been the one worrying about everything. Family dinners, long conversations, holiday celebrations, all of it happened under her care and attention. Yet today, she felt like an outsider, like a shadow inside the very home she had built, someone no one seemed to remember anymore. A year earlier, she had started saving for this trip. She withdrew money from her retirement account, sold valuable antique items in the house, and even taught extra English classes in the evenings to earn more income. All of it was because she wanted a wonderful vacation with her family, a vacation she believed would be an opportunity to bring the generations closer together. But now, she was no longer part of that plan. Susan could not understand it. Her daughter-in-law, Rachel, had always appeared friendly, but Susan had sensed a change in the way she was treated. The subtle words, the distracted glances, all of it felt like signals that she no longer had a place in this family. But when she received Andrew's message, everything became clear. She was no longer part of the family. She was simply the one providing the money, the person ensuring that the trip could happen at all. Memories came rushing back, the time she took Andrew out as a child, the joyful family meals, the handwritten letters her son used to write to her when he was young. Now they all felt like faded colors from another life. She could not understand how her own son could so easily turn his back on her like that. Had she not been the one who raised him, taught him, and given him unconditional love all those years? She looked down at her phone again as another message from Andrew appeared. This time he tried to explain. "Don't misunderstand, Mom. It's not that I don't love you. It's just that we want this trip to be only for my family." Susan felt as if a knife had been pushed into her heart, not because of the words themselves, but because of the coldness within them. It felt like an excuse, a quiet form of rejection. She was no longer a mother, no longer a grandmother. She was simply someone outside their lives, someone expected to step back once she was no longer needed. Susan's eyes blurred as she looked around the house. Everything was still the same. The familiar kitchen, the dining table she had cleaned carefully early that morning, the elegant leather chairs. But now they were only lifeless objects, no longer a warm place for her family. She did not cry. Showing pain had never been easy for her. But inside, she felt a deep, numbing ache. She stood up, walked into her study, and opened her old laptop. The memories of the trip, the things she had done for the family, now felt like nothing more than numbers in a bank account. She looked at the money she had managed to save, the money she had sacrificed piece by piece for this trip. More than $21,000, all poured into this vacation, the vacation she believed would bring the family closer together. But now everything had collapsed. She sat in front of the screen, her hand gently moving the mouse until it stopped at the button labeled Cancel Transaction. One click, and everything would end. But she did not do it immediately. She did not rush the decision. Instead, she opened a new document on the computer and began typing a new list. The list was not for her family, not for Andrew, not for Rachel. It was a list of women she knew, women who had lived in quiet neglect, women who had never received the care and love they truly deserved. And she decided she would take them to Hawaii, women who deserved to be treated like real family. She no longer needed to be part of this family. She no longer needed to stand quietly in the background of cold and indifferent relationships. She would still have this trip, but this time she would choose the people who truly deserved it. And when she finally pressed the cancel transaction button on the screen, it was not just a financial decision. It was a turning point in her life, a moment where she took her power back. Susan did not reply right away. She sat there in the quiet kitchen, the warm yellow light casting soft shadows across the white wall, forming strange shapes that seemed unfamiliar. Everything was still the same, yet somehow everything felt different. A cold, empty feeling slowly spread through her. Everything she had built, everything she had poured her love and effort into, now felt like a sandcastle washed away by the waves. She had given her son everything, the long years of caring for him when he was little, the early mornings waking up to prepare breakfast for the family, the late nights staying awake to teach and guide her children. And now, all she received in return was rejection, cold and distant. Mother was no longer family. Susan took a deep breath, but could not shake the suffocating feeling inside her chest. She looked up at the clock on the wall. 30 minutes had passed since she received that message. She had not picked up her phone again, even though her hands would not stop trembling. Part of her wanted to call Andrew back, wanted to tell him what this pain felt like. But another part of her, the strongest part, understood that any words now would be meaningless. She slowly stood up from the chair and walked out into the garden. The night was dark and quiet, filled only with the rustling of leaves and the gentle wind moving through the branches. Susan walked slowly, each step careful and deliberate. Everything around her was familiar. The small pond her husband had once built beside the garden where the goldfish swam peacefully. The climbing roses along the fence were still blooming, even though no one cared for them except her. Every plant in this garden carried memories of her husband, James. He was the one who had shared the difficult years with her, the unfulfilled dreams, and the great hopes they once held together. She remembered the years with James when they were young, when the two of them owned nothing more than an old car and a worn-out bed, yet their lives were full of joy. Hawaii, a distant place for them back then, had only been a small dream. But it was James who once told her that one day they would go there again, that when they were able to, and when they had a family, they would bring their children with them. And now the trip she had carefully prepared had somehow turned into a betrayal. What had changed? Susan wondered quietly as she looked up at the dark night sky. She had not noticed the change in her family until Rachel appeared. Her daughter-in-law, the woman she once treated like a daughter, had now become a stranger. Rachel controlled everything, from family dinners to holiday plans. Every time Susan tried to join in, tried to stay connected, she felt herself being overshadowed. Little by little, she had been pushed out of her own family's life. And now Andrew, her own son, was the one who made the final decision to push her away. "You are no longer family," Susan repeated the words in her mind. They felt like a sharp blade piercing her heart. What had she done wrong? She had sacrificed so much, and yet all she received in return was silence and forgetfulness. She stood in the middle of the garden, the pain rising inside her chest. The pain was not because she could not join the trip. It was because she had realized that her family had changed. Not changed because of time, but because of selfishness and a lack of respect. Rachel and Andrew had turned her into an outsider, and now she had to face that truth. But in the stillness of the night, a strange feeling slowly began to grow within her. A powerful feeling she had never truly felt before. She was not weak, and she did not need anyone's pity. She had spent her entire life caring for this family, and now she would not allow herself to become a victim of their neglect. Susan walked back into the house and went to her desk, opening the old laptop. The documents for the Hawaii trip appeared on the screen, the contracts and invoices she had paid for herself. Her eyes moved quickly across them, but paused when she saw her travel account. The money she had saved over the past 3 years, $21,000. Every dollar had been earned through effort, late nights teaching classes, refusing to buy things for herself, cutting small expenses from daily life. All of it had been for this purpose. She stared at the account, her hand trembling slightly. A powerful temptation began to rise inside her. With a single click, she could freeze the travel account so that no payment would go through anymore. But Susan did not do it immediately. She did not act out of impulse. Instead, she opened a new document and began typing. Not for her family, but for other people. People she knew would truly appreciate this gesture. The women she had met over the years, the ones who had been forgotten and abandoned, women who were just like her, women who had given everything to their families but were never recognized. She typed each word slowly, writing down the list of people she would invite to join this trip. Women without family beside them, women who had lived through long years of loneliness. And she, instead of returning to the family she had sacrificed so much for, would create new memories with them. This trip would not simply be a vacation, it would be healing, a chance for her to rediscover herself. Susan sat quietly in the darkness, her fingers still typing the final lines. Every word, every sentence felt like a declaration of who she truly was. She no longer needed to be part of that family. She could create a new family of her own. And this time, she would choose people who truly deserved it. Susan stood up, her eyes drifting toward the family photo she had placed on the desk, where James, her late husband, was still smiling happily beside her. That photograph was proof of a time when everything was still whole, when her family had been something inseparable. But now everything was different. The picture had become a painful reminder of things that could never return. Where were the days filled with laughter? Where were the warm holiday nights? Everything had changed, and she had to accept that. She looked at her bank account, then back at the laptop, where the list of women she had decided to invite out on the trip was displayed on the screen. This was not a list for her family. Not Andrew, not Rachel, not the people who had left her standing alone. This was a list of people she truly understood, women whose lives had lost their direction in ways similar to hers, yet who had never been given the chance to be recognized, to be genuinely loved. She thought of Carol, a longtime friend from church who had lost contact with her children after being diagnosed with cancer. Carol, who always kept a smile on her face, even though she knew that with every passing year, the distance between her and her children only grew wider. Then there was Louise, a single mother who struggled every day to care for her autistic son, yet was never acknowledged for the strength it took. And Frances, who had cared for her husband for 20 years until he passed away from heart disease, yet had never received a single word of gratitude or concern from her children. These women were never invited to parties, never welcomed into family gatherings. They rarely had the chance to speak their truth. But Susan knew they were the ones who deserved most to create beautiful memories together. A faint smile appeared on her face as she thought about the trip. This would not be the perfect vacation she had once planned for her family. It would be a healing journey, a place where forgotten women could rediscover themselves. There would be no reluctant participation from people attending out of obligation, only willingness, acceptance, and understanding. And Susan would be the one to guide them. She began contacting each person on the list. Carol was the first. The call was short, yet long enough to fill Carol with surprise and joy. She could hardly believe it, but after a moment of silence, Carol agreed. Next was Louise. When Susan called her, she could hear the nervousness in Louise's voice. Louise had never dared to dream about traveling far from home, yet now the opportunity was right in front of her. Susan felt warmth in her heart when Louise agreed immediately, without hesitation. Frances was different. She needed time to think. She had grown too accustomed to turning down opportunities meant for herself. But Susan did not give up. After a few days, Frances called back and said she would join them. That moment felt like a small victory. The first steps were small, yet deeply meaningful. The following calls went smoothly. Susan felt her heart gradually becoming lighter, a quiet and unexpected joy spreading within her. These women were not simply friends or acquaintances. They were people who had lived in the shadows of society, rarely acknowledged by anyone. Now they would create a memory together with her. This trip was not simply about travel, it was about connection. It was a reminder that even if they had been forgotten, they still deserved a beautiful moment in life. She continued planning the trip. Everything had to be prepared carefully, but this time, there was no longer the burden of trying to satisfy others. Susan no longer needed to please anyone. This journey belonged to her and the women she truly valued. No one would be attending out of obligation. Each person would come willingly because they deserved to be seen, to be appreciated, to be loved. And Susan would be the one to make that possible. A few days later, she received confirmation from the travel agency about the trip. Everything was ready. The seaside villa, the sightseeing tours, the outdoor dinners. Every detail had been arranged with great care. Susan felt as if she had finally rediscovered herself. The years that had passed, the long nights she spent working tirelessly, none of it felt like meaningless sacrifice anymore. She had done all of it to create a meaningful moment for people who truly deserved it. This trip was not just a vacation. It was a journey to reclaim self-worth, a reminder that love is not only about unconditional sacrifice, but also about recognition and mutual respect. And when the trip finally began, Susan knew that even though her own family had left her behind, she was not alone. She had found a new family, a real one, where every person was valued and genuinely cared for. Susan sat in the quiet room, her fingers gliding gently across the laptop keyboard. She had just received a confirmation email from the travel agency about the services booked for the trip. Everything was ready. Only a few days earlier, when she first began planning this journey, everything had still felt uncertain and vague. But now she had it all. A seaside villa, sightseeing trips under the brilliant sun, relaxed meals in a comfortable atmosphere, free from the expectations of others. Everything now belonged to her and to the women she had invited, women who had endured so much, yet had never truly been recognized as they deserved. She pulled an old photograph from the drawer and gazed at the family picture taken before everything began to change. Moments filled with love, cheerful photos of James and the children. She clearly remembered the feeling when her son Andrew was still an innocent child who would run home from school with bright eyes, proudly showing her the drawings he had made. She had spent her entire life protecting this family, building beautiful memories for them. But now she was no longer a part of that picture. Susan felt a gentle wave of pain pass through her, but then she reminded herself that it was time for change. Those memories, though precious, would no longer hold her back. She did not need to continue living in the shadow of a family that no longer respected her. She turned back to the laptop screen and looked at the list of women she had invited. Women like Carol, Louise, and Frances had all agreed to join. They had not needed much persuasion. Each of them carried her own story. Each of them held an empty space in her heart that no one had been able to fill. And this trip, though it seemed like a simple vacation, had become an opportunity for them to rediscover themselves. Susan understood that what they needed was not pity, but genuine recognition and real love. That day, she called each of them again to confirm once more. Carol, Louise, and Frances were all excited and happy when they heard the news. This trip would be a milestone in their lives, an opportunity they had never even dared to imagine. Susan could hear the excitement in their voices. For her, however, this was more than just a vacation. It was a turning point. She felt stronger than she had ever felt before. The days when she exhausted herself trying to please people who never truly appreciated her were now behind her. This was the time for her to live for herself, without worrying about cold glances or words that pierced straight into her heart. Those phone calls made Susan feel as if she had rediscovered her purpose in life. No one could treat her like an invisible person anymore. Every woman on this trip deserved to be loved, and none of them would have to hide their emotions or their vulnerability. That was what Susan was determined to create for them, a space where they could breathe, where they could simply be themselves without wearing a mask. As she continued preparing for the journey, Susan also began thinking about the activities that would take place throughout the week. She wanted to create memories they could keep forever, not fleeting memories, but moments that would stay deeply in each of their hearts. Evenings gathered around the dining table where they could share things that had never been spoken before. Peaceful mornings by the sea when sunlight illuminated the gentle waves touching the shore. And above all, she wanted each of them to feel understanding and love. As the departure day approached, Susan felt a strange joy rising within her. She had once believed that this trip would be a chance to repair the cracks in her family, to rebuild her relationship with Andrew and Rachel. But now she realized that it was no longer important. She had found another family. a family not built on blood ties, but on empathy, sharing, and sincere love. Each person on this journey carried her own story and her own path, and Susan would be the one guiding them, not to heal only her own wounds, but to help each of them find peace within their hearts. When the day of the trip finally arrived, she no longer felt anxious or confused like before. Everything was ready. Her hands firmly held her suitcase, as if she were holding the freedom she had finally found for herself. The suitcases were filled with hopes and dreams, both hers and those of the women she cherished. This journey was not simply about going somewhere, it was about returning to herself, returning to the true values she had forgotten for so long. When the group arrived at the airport, Susan saw the radiant faces of Carol, Louise, Frances, and the new friends who had joined them. They laughed, they celebrated, they exchanged warm embraces. There was no more loneliness, no more pain. Everything now was filled with hope. And Susan realized that even if she had once been abandoned somewhere in the past, she had found her own path, a path filled with light and freedom. Susan stepped into the seaside villa with steady, confident steps. The scene before her made her feel as if she had entered another world, a world no longer bound by unreasonable expectations and quiet rejections. Tall palm trees stretched up from the earth, the gentle sound of waves echoed softly beside her, and the warm ocean air wrapped around her like a tender, comforting embrace. This was a place where she could truly breathe, without worrying about who might judge her or who might see her as a burden. She walked into this space with a sense of calm in her heart, ready to rediscover herself. When Susan arrived, the women were already there. Carol, Louise, and Frances, her friends, were standing beside a large table with bright smiles on their faces. They looked at one another as if they were reuniting with a dear friend they had not seen in years. Susan clearly felt the difference between these women and the people she had faced before. They did not look at her with pity or treat her like a burden. They looked at her as a friend, a mother, a companion, walking beside them on the journey to find peace. She smiled back at them and felt lighter than she had in a very long time. "Hello, everyone," Susan said, her voice calm and warm. "At last we can sit together, can't we?" "At last," Carol replied, her eyes shining. "I never thought I would see something this beautiful. This trip truly feels like a miracle." Susan smiled, sensing the sincerity in Carol's words. She felt happy not only because she saw her friends smiling, but also because she felt as if she were coming back to life, rediscovering the joy in living that she had unintentionally lost during so many long years. "Thank you for coming," Susan said as she sat down beside them. "We are going to create wonderful memories, I promise you that." Their first dinner together passed in a warm and comfortable atmosphere. The food was simple but full of flavor, and the stories they shared about life, about dreams, and about the struggles each of them had faced created a feeling of closeness and intimacy. Everyone joined the conversation. No one was left behind. Laughter filled the air, encouraging glances were exchanged, and together they formed a picture filled with color and hope. When the meal ended, the group walked outside to the yard, where a large table had been placed near the shore. On the table, a candle burned softly, its light flickering in the night and reflecting gently on the surface of the water. They sat around the table, the dim glow making it feel as if they had stepped into another world, not the world they had left behind. This was a new world, a place where kindness did not need to be questioned, and where everyone was respected and truly seen. "What can we do to create truly beautiful memories on this trip?" Susan asked, gently breaking the quiet. "We could spend each evening telling our stories," Louise said softly but with certainty. "We could share the things we have not dared to say for so long." "Thank you, Louise," Susan replied, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you for being here and helping create these memories with me." Frances, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. "We could take walks in the morning when the sun rises. I have always dreamed of seeing the sunrise over the sea, but I never had the chance." "We will do that," Susan smiled as she looked at each face around her. "We will walk along the beach every morning. I want all of us to feel the beauty of this life." A gentle and comforting silence settled over them. There were no more worries, no more exhaustion, only the warm air, the soft sound of waves, and the presence of these women, women who had touched Susan's heart in a deep and meaningful way. This journey was not about restoring the memories she had lost within her family. It was about creating new memories, memories not only for herself, but also for the friends she had chosen. These women were not just companions, they were the family she had always been searching for. A family not bound by blood, but by true connection, strengthened by understanding and unconditional care. The next day, the group began visiting the famous sites of the island. At every place they went, they felt a sense of closeness and belonging that had long been forgotten. No one in the group felt like an outsider. They blended naturally together, sharing stories, laughter, and even quiet sadness, and each of them felt that they had finally found a place where they truly belonged. As the days passed, more and more moments made Susan realize that this journey was not simply an escape from reality, it was a rebirth. She no longer felt abandoned, no longer felt like a forgotten piece in the lives of those she once loved. She had found a new family, a family where every person had value, where everyone was appreciated, and most importantly, where each person felt worthy of love. This was the family she had been searching for all these years, and for the first time in her life, Susan truly felt seen. As the days passed in the quiet warmth of the seaside villa, Susan felt as if she were living again for the first time. Every morning, the group walked together along the beach, watching the sunrise spread its light across the water. Golden rays shimmered on the surface of the sea, awakening memories Susan once believed she had forgotten. Their gentle steps moved across the warm sand, cheerful conversations flowed easily, and bursts of laughter filled the air. All the simple joys she had not truly felt for many years. But now every moment was real again, as if time had turned back and she had been given the chance to live fully once more. During those mornings, Susan realized she was no longer worried about proving herself to anyone, no longer afraid of rejection or cold, distant glances. These women asked nothing from her except her presence and her willingness to share. No one here felt like a burden. Each person carried her own story, her own pain and sacrifices that had never been spoken before. Yet here they could breathe, they could live, and they could care for one another without hiding who they truly were. Evenings continued with emotional conversations around the dinner table. One by one, the women began opening their hearts, telling stories about their past, about the moments they felt forgotten, about the times they believed they had no value. Yet, within the warmth of that space, they found understanding and sincere compassion. The journey was not simply a vacation. It was a path of rediscovering themselves. For Susan, it became the moment she finally felt healing from old relationships and from wounds she had never dared to face. Each night, after the lights were turned off and everyone had gone to their rooms, Susan remained alone in the living room, looking out toward the endless sea. She thought about the years that had passed, the sacrifices she had made for her family, the dreams she had quietly buried. What remained after all those years, she wondered? Old wounds and unanswered questions. Yet now she felt different. Those questions no longer troubled her heart. She no longer needed acceptance from people who did not know how to value her. She had found people who truly deserved love, people who asked for nothing except honesty and sincerity. As she sat quietly reflecting on everything that had happened, Susan felt a strange and beautiful sense of relief. The past few days had not only been a holiday, they had been an opportunity for her to rediscover herself. She no longer felt like an extra presence in someone else's life. She had become an important part of this journey, someone who brought light to women who were searching for understanding and love. The lonely days were gone. The moments of invisibility were gone. Susan had found her family, a new family built on sharing and empathy. One morning, as the group stood by the sea while the waves moved gently along the shore, Susan looked at the women she had invited on this journey. They were not only companions on a trip, they were people she truly considered family. She felt the connection in the air, a warmth she had never experienced in so many years before. Yes, family was not always defined by blood. Family was the people we choose to share life with, the ones who respect us, care for us, and remain beside us during difficult moments. Thank you for being here, Susan said softly but with certainty. I did not know how I would feel when I came here, but now I feel something deeper. You helped me understand that love does not always come from the people we expect. Love can come from the people we never imagined, the ones who truly see us. The women looked at each other and smiled with sincerity. It was a quiet moment without words, only understanding reflected in their eyes. They did not need to say anything more. They understood one another, and they knew that this journey was not simply a vacation, but a turning point for all of them. As the day came to an end, Susan felt as if she had finally found something she had lost long ago: peace. She no longer felt like an outsider. She had created a new family where every person had value, where everyone was cared for and truly seen. This was the family she had been searching for all these years. And as Susan sat there, looking at the smiling faces beside her, she knew she had received a gift more precious than anything else: real love and true recognition. Susan sat inside the seaside villa, looking out through the large glass window. The scenery around her was beautiful. Yet for her, it was only a quiet backdrop for the deep reflections filling her mind. With each passing day, she felt closer to the friends she had invited on this journey. The morning walks along the beach, the warm dinners shared together, all of it made her feel as though she had been given a second life. Not a life returning to old memories, not a life lived under the shadow of broken relationships, but a life in a new world where she no longer needed to struggle to prove her worth. Her friends, Carol, Louise, Frances, and the others, had begun sharing their own stories, the pain they had carried through life. Every story was moving. Every tear held memories that were impossible to forget. Yet none of them saw themselves as weak. They did not need to hide their wounds or their losses. They could share everything freely without fear of judgment or rejection. And Susan was the same. She no longer needed to wear a mask. She could simply be herself, with all of her pain, her vulnerability, and her strength. This journey was not only about visiting beautiful places, it was not simply about a luxurious holiday. It was about healing the wounds of the heart, about facing the past and accepting oneself. These women, whether they had once been forgotten or never truly recognized, all deserved love and appreciation. And Susan, by inviting them on this journey, had done something meaningful. She had brought them back to themselves, helping them rediscover their value. One evening after dinner, the group sat around the table, sharing memories and thoughts about the journey. Each person spoke about what she had learned and the emotions she had experienced during the past days. Carol, who had once felt lonely and forgotten, now felt cared for and respected. Louise, who had spent her entire life taking care of her family without receiving much attention in return, now felt more valued than ever before. Frances, who had cared for her husband through difficult years, could finally feel the understanding and compassion of the people around her. Susan sat quietly listening to every story, and a deep sense of joy slowly rose in her heart. This journey, even though it was not perfect, had created wonderful moments, moments that she and her friends would remember forever, moments where they could look at one another and feel truly loved and respected. "Thank you all," Susan said softly, her voice gentle but filled with emotion. "This trip was never just about going somewhere. It was about finding ourselves again. We shared stories, memories, and pain, and more importantly, we rediscovered our own strength. I am deeply grateful that you are here with me, creating these memories together." Carol, Louise, and Frances looked at one another, then turned toward Susan with sincere smiles. They could all feel the change in the atmosphere, the warmth and love within those words. None of them felt abandoned or alone anymore. They had found a new family, a family not built by blood, but by understanding and mutual respect. The following days passed in relaxation and peace. The group continued visiting places around the island, but without hurry, without the pressure of trying to see everything in a short time. Every activity was enjoyed fully. Every step, every conversation, every moment became special. They no longer felt like outsiders. They felt connected to one another, companions walking together on this journey. One day, as the group stopped by the sea, watching the waves gently reach the shore, Susan felt a strange realization within her heart. She no longer felt like an outsider in a family. She no longer felt like someone forced to live under the shadow of others. This journey had helped her understand that family is not always defined by blood. Family can be the people we choose, the people who see our value and stay beside us not because they must, but because they truly care and respect who we are. As the final day of the trip approached, Susan sat alone by the shore, watching the sun slowly setting over the ocean. A peaceful feeling spread through her heart. She had found something she had lost long ago: acceptance and love. This journey was not simply a vacation. It was a path back to herself, a turning point that allowed her to live without the emptiness of missing love and recognition. She had found her true family, not among those who had left her behind, but among those who had come into her life and stayed. Susan smiled as she looked out toward the distance where the waves touched the sand, listening to the sound of the ocean and feeling a deep sense of freedom within her heart. She had found a new family, a family where she no longer felt like an outsider, and that made her feel loved, respected, and most importantly, free to be herself. As the journey slowly came to an end, Susan did not feel regret. With each passing day, she realized more clearly that she had gained something far more precious than any expectations or hopes she once carried. On the final night on the island, the group of women sat around a table outdoors under the soft glow of warm yellow lights, surrounded by laughter and stories that had never been told before. Each of them carried a life story, filled with unseen sacrifices and quiet pain that they had never been able to share with anyone. But tonight they could finally breathe easily, no longer feeling abandoned, no longer feeling like invisible figures within society. Susan looked at the faces of the friends who had stood beside her throughout these days. Every woman carried her own story. Every one of them had lived through difficult years, and they understood one another without needing many words. In the dim light, they all felt valued and cared for. It was the feeling Susan had searched for during so many years, not recognition from those who had once turned away from her, but genuine understanding and true affection from people who appreciated her worth. The final dinner felt warm and meaningful. The dishes were simple yet filled with care, each one representing a small act of sharing, with a piece of a moment that would never be forgotten. No one was rushing, no one felt forced to be part of someone else's life. They simply ate together, talked together, and quietly felt the connection growing in every moment. It was something Susan had never been able to find within her former family, a family she had given everything to build, only to eventually be forgotten. After dinner, the group stepped outside into the yard, where sparkling lights created a magical atmosphere. The women gathered around a large table and began talking about the lives they had lived. Carol spoke about the lonely years after her divorce, about the moments when she felt forgotten, even within her own family. Louise shared the sacrifices no one had understood when she had to raise her sick child without help or recognition. Frances, a single mother who had spent years caring for her seriously ill husband, spoke about the long days when she felt like nothing more than a shadow, someone who was never truly seen. Yet within this atmosphere, none of them felt weak. They did not feel the need to hide their pain or their wounds. In that moment, Susan realized she was no longer alone. She looked at these faces and understood that this was the family she had been searching for. These women were not the children she had given birth to, yet they were the people with whom she could share everything, the people she could truly trust. "We have found one another," Susan said softly, her voice gentle but filled with emotion. "Each of us has lived through things no one else knew about, but here today, we are part of one another's lives, and that is what matters most." The women looked at each other and smiled warmly. They did not need to say anything more because they understood exactly what Susan meant. They did not need to pretend to be strong or hide their deepest feelings. Each of them deserved to be loved and understood, and for the first time in many long years, they finally felt that understanding from the friends beside them. On the final day of the trip, they decided to spend their time walking along the beach. There was no hurry, no worries about things that needed to be done, only gentle footsteps on the sand, knowing glances between friends, and bursts of laughter echoing through the air. The last sunlight of the day spread across the sea, creating a strangely peaceful scene. Susan looked toward the slowly setting sun and felt a quiet calm within her heart. She no longer felt the need to prove herself. She had found her true family, a family where love did not need to be measured or proven. It simply existed in every shared moment. When they returned to the villa, a warm silence surrounded the group. No one spoke, yet everyone felt the connection that had grown during those days together. This journey had given them not only beautiful memories, but also a sense of renewal. Susan no longer felt like an outsider. She had found people she could trust, people she could share everything with, and most importantly, people she could love without fearing rejection or abandonment. The journey ended, yet Susan did not feel sadness. She felt no regret about what had passed. Instead, she felt freedom. Not because the trip was over, but because she had discovered something far more important: love and recognition from these women. And for the first time in her life, Susan truly felt seen, loved, and respected. As they left the villa, each woman carried a piece of the journey within her heart. But for Susan, it was the beginning of a new life. A life no longer weighed down by burdens or unreasonable expectations from those who did not deserve her. She had found her true family, and that was the most precious gift this journey had given her. On the final day of the trip, Susan stood by the shoreline watching the waves gently reach the sand under the late afternoon sunlight. A strangely peaceful feeling filled her heart. Even though it was only a journey, she knew this was far more than a simple vacation. It was a path she had been searching for over many years. She had found a new family, a family not formed through blood, but through understanding, empathy, and unconditional care. A family where she did not have to struggle to be loved, where she did not have to prove her worth. The women in the group were not only companions on this journey, they were people she could truly share everything with, people she could trust. Carol, Louise, Frances, they were women she had connected with through shared experiences. Each of them carried a story. Each had faced hardships in life without ever receiving the recognition or love they deserved. But now, they no longer felt alone. They had one another, and that was what mattered most. This trip, even though it was brief, helped Susan rediscover herself. She no longer felt like an outsider. She no longer felt lost within the very family she had spent her entire life trying to build. Susan looked at her friends and realized that this was the family she had been searching for all along. People who understood and valued her. People who helped her see her own worth again. Yet the journey brought her something more. It awakened a realization within her. Susan understood that love does not always come from the people we expect. Sometimes the people who are not bound to us by blood are the ones who are most willing to love us sincerely and recognize who we truly are. Meanwhile, the people closest to us can sometimes be the ones who forget our sacrifices most easily, the ones who push us aside when we are no longer needed. While the group was taking their final photos on the beach, Susan stood quietly nearby, watching them. The bright smiles on the faces of Carol, Louise, and Frances warmed her heart. These were moments she had never experienced during previous trips. These were moments she had never had the chance to share with her former family. These moments were not forced participation or empty connections. They were genuine presence, a bond that could be felt without needing to be spoken. Susan smiled and looked up toward the sky. A bird glided across the blue horizon, as if reminding her that everything in life has its own reason and purpose. She had once believed she would never find joy or freedom again. Yet now she understood that happiness is not something waiting for us somewhere else. It is something we create for ourselves through sincere and loving relationships. This journey came to an end, yet it left a deep mark in Susan's heart. She had not only found new friends, she had also found herself again. She no longer felt abandoned or forgotten. Everything during this trip carried meaning. Every story, every conversation, every burst of laughter reminded her that she was still important. What she had lost before was never something she truly deserved to lose. It was simply something that had never truly belonged to her. Most importantly, Susan realized that love is not unconditional sacrifice. It is mutual respect and recognition. She no longer needed to accept neglect or rejection. She deserved a better life. She deserved relationships that brought real happiness and joy. When the group began heading to the airport, long farewell hugs and promises to meet again in the future filled the moment with emotion. Susan felt lighter than she had in years. The loneliness was gone, the feeling of chasing after someone's approval had disappeared. She finally understood that what she needed was not people who accepted her without truly understanding her, but people who valued and respected who she was. These women were the family she had been searching for. On the way home, Susan did not feel sadness. She did not feel regret that the journey had ended. Instead, she felt a strange sense of freedom, a freedom that came from deep within her heart. She no longer worried about the expectations of others. She no longer needed to live according to a story that was never truly hers. She had found her own voice, and she would continue her journey without fear and without doubt. When Susan returned home, she felt different. Everything around her looked the same, yet within herself she had discovered a new part of who she was. She no longer felt lonely in her own home. This journey had taught her that sometimes we must step away from unhealthy relationships in order to find a new world and a new family. And now Susan understood that she no longer had to do everything simply to be loved. She had learned to love and accept herself, and that was what mattered most. By the end of the journey, she had not only rediscovered a family, she had rediscovered herself. For the first time in many years, she truly felt free, no longer tied to the pain of the past. She had found a new life where she was not an outsider, but someone who could actively create beautiful memories. She had found her true family, a place where love was given sincerely, and that was the most precious gift this journey had brought into her life. This journey was not simply a vacation. It was a path toward rediscovering oneself and building sincere relationships. Susan found a new family, a place where love and recognition did not need to be proven, they only needed to be shared. What truly matters is that even when we are forgotten, we can still create meaningful memories with people who understand and appreciate us. If this story touched your heart, please do not forget to share your thoughts in the comments below the video. Remember to like and subscribe so you can join us in discovering many more inspiring and meaningful stories. Because when we finally find our true family, that is the moment we realize that love and recognition can appear in places we never expected. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next stories.